Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author and PhD in literature. Today, I am so delighted to dive into Penelope Fitzgerald's Offshore. I'm going to begin this talk right now. If you happen to be on YouTube, I'm in California. It has gotten so dark. We're having a lot of cloud cover move through. Apparently, it's going to be real dark here, and it's going to get really bright. So everyone on YouTube can know that this is a lighting effect that I myself am not trying to produce. But back to the book. I like to begin these talks with the question of why am I wanting to read a book at a certain time? And Offshore is a book that I am wanting to read all the time. It is a book that I find endlessly fascinating. It is brief, it is so heartfelt, it is so rich, and it is so interesting. And it's one of these ones that I return to again and again. This time, I think I was brought back to it actually by Shirley Jackson's Hangs a Man. I had not read any Shirley Jackson, I think because I was traumatized by The Lottery back in middle school. But Hangs a Man is, talk about an intriguing book. If you have not read that book and you love Penelope Fitzgerald, you should definitely go read Hangs a Man and then go listen to my lecture on it. But Hangs a Man is a book very much like this one, where everything seems so intelligent, but is also funny and dark, and everything is a little off kilter. Everything is a little bit strange. And one of the things that we are going to look at today as we dive into the prose of Offshore is the way that Penelope Fitzgerald is making her prose unique and engaging, and in many ways kind of off kilter. This is a good time at the beginning to let you know we're not going to have any spoilers. Hopefully what I will be doing is giving you a sense of why the prose itself is so good, why what you're reading is really so moving and so funny and so dark and sophisticated and intelligent. For those of you who like an agenda, here is what we're going to get up to. We're going to do a very brief biography of Penelope Fitzgerald. Back when I was aspiring to write, she was so inspirational to me because she didn't really start writing until her late 50s. She was 58 when she first published, and she was pretty prolific from 60 to when she died at 83. And I used to find that incredibly inspirational. I still find it inspirational just because this was a woman who toward the end of her life was really firing on all cylinders. But her life was also very interesting, and many of the works are autobiographical in a way that is really artfully done. So we'll do a very quick bio. We're then going to dive into Offshore. We're going to talk about the title, the opening, and the narrative stance. It's a really, really interesting narrator, and looking at that narrator helps us understand why the book feels both very light and very kind of concise and spare, but also so incredibly rich. We're going to talk about figurative language. She is so good at metaphor and metaphor, simile, symbolism, personification, all of these different things. And it's never heavy-handed, and it is always so well done. We're going to take a look at this kind of off-kilter prose that we also see in Shirley Jackson. In this case, we're going to look at it specifically in terms of the descriptions of minor characters. I do not know anyone who does this as well as she does. It's also, honestly, as we're going through, just revisiting the prose in any kind of analytical way is just such an absolute pleasure. And at the very end, I said that we weren't going to have any spoilers. At the very end, I'm going to talk briefly about the ending of the book, but I'll let you know before I'm going to do that so that people who don't want to know it don't, in fact, have to hear me talk about it. Okay, so we're going to dive in with this biography. Penelope was born in 1916. She died in the year 2000. She was 83 years old. She came from this family called the Knox family. Her father had 3 brothers, the Knox brothers. She, in fact, wrote a biography about them. There were 3 uncles and her dad. Really, really literary family. Her father was one of the editors of Punch magazine, and one of her uncles was a theologian, a very important theologian. So she came from this very educated, very patriarchal in many ways kind of world. And there were very high expectations of her. She went to Oxford. She then went on to work at the BBC during the war, and she has a novel about it that is so good. Again, many of the novels are autobiographical, and this one, it's not known as her very best work, but it is. I just found it absolutely incredible. She, to me, seemed so heroic. I mean, anyone who survived all of those bombings and all the blitzing and whatnot in England at that time just seems like an absolute hero. In 1942, she married someone named Desmond Fitzgerald. He did fight in the Second World War, and in Wikipedia it says he returned to civilian life an alcoholic. So they in many ways were very much in love. It was a very passionate relationship, but he was someone who was not able to support her very well, and they really had, in a lot of ways, a very not contemptuous. They had a very tempestuous kind of relationship. He was a co-editor at a magazine. They did a bunch of literary work together, although she wasn't writing like on her own steam at this point. At one point, they describe, a lot of this is just coming straight from Wikipedia. He was disbarred because he was forging checks at one point. They had 3 little kids, Valpy, Tina, and Maria. And they were really living in really, very like diminished states at one point. At one point, they were in like a shelter kind of a place. Because their finances were in such terrible straits, Penelope Fitzgerald did a lot of teaching. She taught at something called the Italia Conti Academy that was like a drama school that also gave her fodder for a different novel that she wrote. She taught at Queen's Gate and other schools. And at Queen's Gate, which apparently it was called a posh crammer, is what they called it in Wikipedia, I think. Or maybe this came from the introduction, my book. But you get the sense that it was a school for like a lot of rich, famous kids. And in fact, Queen Camilla and Anna Wintour and Helena Bonham Carter were all students of hers. At 58, as I mentioned, she wrote a couple of biographies, one of them being of her uncles. She wrote The Bookshop in 1978. That was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. That's an interesting book. It has a bunch of kind of supernatural elements that are really fascinating to me, but also still has this like very warm and joyful and smart and kind of off-kilter feel. In 1979, she published Offshore and did win the Booker Prize. She knew that she was like a dark horse, was probably not likely to win the prize, but it really established her as one of these like very important writers of the moment. She went on to write a whole bunch of things, but there were a couple of more autobiographical novels, and then she wrote some historical novels that spanned all sorts of different like geographical areas and also different time periods. And some of that, it's so impressive because she can transport us through time and history and geography, but you still have kind of this same feel. As I am saying all of this, I'm just like, why are we not just reading Penelope Fitzgerald all the time? If you are someone who likes biography, Hermione Lee wrote the most amazing biography of her. I mean, her life was so insane that like, and it's so fun to read this kind of like biography of an author and then like look at all of the different ways that her actual life can be mapped onto the novels. It's, if again, I mean, it's Hermione Lee never fails to write like a 1,000-page book. The one of Virginia Woolf is incredible. She's really good. I believe there's one of Edith Wharton, but the one of Penelope Fitzgerald is just, it's riveting. So we're going to go ahead and dive in now. We're going to do something slightly unusual, which is to look at some of the praise. We're going to read some of the blurbs from my edition here. I have a whole bunch of her books that all are in this Mariner edition. It's Houghton Mifflin. I always want to say Dunder Mifflin every time I say Houghton Mifflin, but from The Office, of course. And I have to say, I don't love the covers of this whole Mariner series, but I'm really, really appreciative of the fact that they did reprint all of these books that were published in the the late 70s and early 80s, and really gave Penelope Fitzgerald like a whole other life, or at least kept that life going. The praise for Offshore and for Penelope Fitzgerald in general, I was so taken by it. And I think that this kind of like inventive appraisal really speaks to just the quality of her as a writer. So here's what we have in the Sunday Times. It says, "This is an astonishing book, hardly more than 50,000 words. It is written with a manic economy that makes it seem even shorter, and with a tamped down force that continually explodes in a series of exactly controlled detonations." Which is so crazy to me. I mean, part of me is like, this must have been written by a dude. Like, it's so bellic, so war-like here. What's surprising too is my copy is 181 pages. A novella is like 170, so it's practically a novella. But her books to me do not. I mean, they're absolutely delightful because they don't feel short, but they are short. There's like a lot of white space on this page. Like you can read these fairly quickly, but they're so rich. Much is made of the idea of this economy here. So this person called it a manic economy, and we see the same in a couple of the other blurbs. So the Washington Post, a guy named Michael Durda in the Washington Post said this: "Where some writers like to build effects slowly, Fitzgerald prefers a quicksilver economy, vivid, elegant, astonishing." So we have economy there again. And then we have it a third time. So it's the third time we're mentioning economy in 3 blurbs. Michael Hoffman, who's from the New York Times Review of Books, says this, or describes the books as the following: "Dry, shrewd, sympathetic, and sharply economical." That I'm glancing down here. We have Richard Ader from the Los Angeles Times says that she's the finest British writer alive, which is like a very big thing to say. So part of the reason why I wanted to look at that is this focus on the idea of her work being very economical. In some ways, it feels so lush, but I do think when people are talking about the economical stuff, we're going to take a look at her descriptions of characters. She does so much work. Like the prose itself can feel kind of baroque and really like fascinating and kind of strange. And as I said, off kilter. But because the work is so like dense and rich, you just don't need that much of it. It's not even dense. I mean, you can tell I'm having a little bit of a hard time explaining, and what we need to do is actually dive into the prose itself. But I do think it's interesting to think about the economy because it really does speak to the way that she is so good at pinpointing things that do feel off kilter and that are incredibly revealing. So whenever we dive into the title of a book, I always feel compelled to reiterate this idea here on the Fox page that if you want a richer reading experience, all you have to do is just really pay attention. And one thing to kind of mine in terms of having a richer experience is the title of a book. Offshore is so good. Penelope Fitzgerald herself has said that what's important to her is that these people are just offshore. They are not like way out far from shore. And I think that in that sense, it's a little bit tricky because offshore to me, like I mean, honestly, what comes to mind is like offshore drilling. And offshore drilling is not like right offshore. At least if you're in California, it's like, hundreds of miles out to sea. But what she was trying to convey with offshore, and maybe there's like a little British thing here, is that you're kind of just offshore. You're not out to sea. And when she did have translations of titles that had more of a connotation of like adrift or like out to sea, that was very much not what she was trying to talk about. It's not about being adrift and like far from land. It's about being very close to the shore. So what she's getting at there with this title, and certainly with her explanation of it, is this idea of a liminal space. So a liminal space is simply a place where you're kind of like not one thing and not another. In literature, it's this is a fun little way to look at things. If you can think of a liminal space as kind of not one or the other, for example, think of a doorway or a hallway or a train station. So these are things where you're kind of not the one or not the other when you're in transit. And what happens in these spaces is there is a lot of like expectation and a lot of like potential for change, for some sort of evolution. So if you're moving from one thing to the other, presumably in literature, you're going to have some sort of growth. Something is going to happen. If you have someone in a liminal space and they don't change, if nothing changes as they walk down the hallway or they pass from one room to the other, I mean, obviously, this is not just simply every time someone walks through a door, you're going to have some sort of, major transformation. But this idea is that in these liminal spaces, you would potentially have change. And if you don't, that is significant. So this idea of being offshore is very much about this liminal space. You're neither onshore nor out to sea. You're kind of in both of the places and neither of the places. And this is such an important point in this book because it has everything to do with our protagonist, Nena, because she is in the middle of so many different things. She's not quite Canadian. She hasn't been home for a long time. She hasn't talked to her sister for a long time. And she's not quite British because, she's literally not British. She's not married. I mean, she is married, but she's kind of like, she's technically married, but she's also kind of not married. At one point, her husband says she's not a woman. She's kind of neither woman nor not woman. She's mother, like obviously she has children, so she is a mother, but she's also kind of not a mother. These are girls who are very much parenting themselves and in fact parenting her. She's someone who is like, living on a ship, but she's also not someone who knows anything about ships. And everyone, you could do that with every single person who is living here. Everyone's kind of between one thing or another. And that makes for such interesting things to happen. It really, there's a lot of pressure when people are between things. And Penelope Fitzgerald, is putting everyone between all sorts of different categories. There's another kind of like adage in writing that like one really good way to sort of structure a novel is to put a bunch of people together in a small-ish space and then put pressure on them. So the best example of this I can think of is Bel Canto by Anne Patchett. You have a bunch of people, hostages who are all in this small space and you're putting a lot of pressure on them. We have a little bit of that here. You have these people who are all kind of misfits, who are all living together, and there are enormous pressures, not only from nature and the fact that all of their boats are in disrepair, and economical questions, which are besieging all of them. But each of them is having relationship issues. They're all kind of not stable in any given sense. And it makes for so much drama and so much potential for all sorts of different things, either for them to evolve or not evolve. We're going to move on now to take a look at the epigraph. The epigraph is fascinating to me. I went ahead and did a bunch of work for you people. So what we have here is che mena il vento e che batte la pioggia e che si incontran con si aspre lingue. So this is clearly Italian. I mean, honestly, for me, mostly if someone has an epigraph and it's in Italian, especially if it's in verse, I'm always like, okay, this is probably Dante. Sure enough, it is Dante. I am not someone who is a Dante scholar. I don't speak Italian, but this comes from Canto 11 from the Inferno. So you have this idea right at the beginning of someone being a real literary heavyweight. Like this is someone, she's not giving us a translation of it. She's not even telling us who wrote it. There's a kind of expectation here of a reader as paying attention and as, frankly, as being educated. If you don't know it, obviously it's totally fine to skip right over it. And there is a sense too, it's a totally, I mean, it's a different language. It's like ancient. All of those things make it very different from the novel itself. But there's also kind of a larger thing where the novel is, it's off kilter and it's intelligent and it's strange and economical and surprising and unique, but it's not difficult to read. It's difficult to get everything out of it because it is deceivingly kind of economical. But we do have the sense from the beginning that she has very high expectations of her reader, even though you can be a reader who has no idea what any of this says, obviously. She does a thing that I absolutely love when writers do this. On page 19, she harkens back to this epigraph. This is one of these moments where we have this incredibly like astute and rich and really interesting description on the part of Penelope Fitzgerald. It's also an example of the range and the kind of different registers in which she writes. So this varies quite a bit from what we're going to look at when we look at the opening, but it gives you a sense of like the heavyweight literary mind that we are dealing with here. So again, this is on page 19. But rat-ridden and neglected, it was a wharf still. The river's edge, where Virgil's ghosts held out their arms and longing for the farther shore, and Dante, as a living man, was refused passage by the ferryman. The few planks that mark the meeting point of land and water, there, surely, is a place to stop and reflect. Even if, as Father Watson did, you stumble over a 10-gallon tin of creosote. So this is so engaging. So we have this very kind of like high-flown echo of this epigraph. We have the idea of Dante. We have the idea of Virgil. We have the idea of this really like significant idea of the inferno, like of going down into hell. But then we have this idea, and all of this is happening with Father Watson. So he is a priest who is coming essentially, this is not spoiling anything because we're on page 19. He's coming to tell Nena that her daughters need to return to school. But we have this idea of this like description of the space that is so like dramatic in kind of like the most real sense of that word because of this high literary drama from the Inferno. And then it is brought down to earth with this kind of a thump here at the end with this very mundane idea of that it's a good place to stop and reflect, even if, as Father Watson did, you stumble over a 10-gallon tin of creosote. It is so good, these different registers in which she's working. Okay, we're now going to dive in. We're going to backtrack a little bit and dive into the beginning of the book itself. And a couple of important things to remember as we do. One of the things that's happening here, we're diving into a conversation in media res, which means it's already happening. We as readers are being just dropped right into the middle of it. And in many ways, what Penelope Fitzgerald is doing is she's having us feel kind of unmoored, no pun intended there. She's having us feel unmoored and kind of like discombobulated because everyone in the novel is feeling like that. We are being dropped right into the middle of a meeting of all of the people who own these boats on the Thames. But no one here is very sure of themselves, so the reader is dropped right into it in a way that is so delicious. So on page 1 of my copy, we have this. Are we to gather that Dreadnought is asking us all to do something dishonest? Richard asked. Dreadnought nodded, glad to have been understood so easily. This is such a strong opening. The idea here that we're beginning with the question of honesty and dishonesty and this idea of collusion and all of these people together doing something that is somewhat illicit. Extremely important, and I can't believe I haven't mentioned this yet, is the fact that Penelope Fitzgerald, in all of her work, she really sought to raise up people who were considered failures by society, but not by her. She was someone who was often kind of misunderstood and kind of on the fringes of things and lived in relative poverty and felt like she wasn't maybe, meeting the expectation of her uncles and her father. And yet she was someone who had gigantic compassion for people and respected, the characteristics that were important to her, things like originality and creativity and living with conviction, and also being understanding of people who are just not operating in the way that society would expect them to. She writes a lot about misfits and people who are kind of misunderstood. If you read the introduction to this, you know this, but one of the characters here in real life, when she was living on the boats, because Penelope Fitzgerald did live on a boat with her children, one of the people who lived there with her, who was very much like Morris in the book, he came and one day did something very nice for her, and then the next day went and drowned himself. And she mentioned that it was very tragic because in no way did she see him a failure. So she sees these people who, the society might see as failures. She does not see them that way, and so she is lifting them up. So then we move on here after they have said that, basically, is Dreadnought asking us all to lie? And then we go on. Just as a means of making a sale, it seems the only way around my problem. If all present wouldn't mind agreeing not to mention my main leak, or rather not to raise the question of my main leak unless direct enquiries are made. Do you, in point of fact, want us to say that Dreadnought doesn't leak? Asked Richard patiently. That would be putting it too strongly. All the meetings of the boat owners, by a movement as natural as the tides themselves, took place on Richard's converted ton-class minesweeper. The name of his ship is Lord Jim. Lord Jim, a felt reproof to amateurs, in speckless, always renewed gray paint, overshadowed the other craft and was nearly twice their tonnage, just as Richard, in his decent dark blue blazer, dominated the meeting itself. And yet he by no means wanted this responsibility. Living on Battersea Reach, overlooked by some very good houses and under the surveillance of the Port of London Authority, entailed, surely, a certain standard of conduct. Richard would be one of the last men on earth or water to want to impose it, yet someone must. Duty is what no one else will do at the moment. Fortunately, he did not have to define duty. War service in the RNVR and his whole temperament before and since had done that for him. So there's something really interesting that's happening right from the beginning. We have this idea of these people in the meeting. We're learning new things that when you are in port and you are all together on the actual water, that you are called by the name of your ship. But right away, we are in the mind of Richard. And what's so beautiful about that is we are learning so much about him, but there's a complexity here because he is known and he's sort of thrust into this position of authority, but he doesn't want that. So you have right away this sense of complexity in people. No one is a flat character ever in Penelope Fitzgerald. Everyone has all of this different nuance. And right from the start, we know it's very, very subtle, but we know that we are in his mind because we have things like Richard would be one of the last men on earth or water to want to impose it, yet someone must. Duty is what no one else will do at the moment. So I have in my copy of the book, I actually wrote little quotation marks around that because it's kind of like you can imagine this is a phrase that is like welling up from either his naval duty or his youth or something. So we have this sense of using his words and being in his brain. And then we move out of that into other people's consciousness. And we also have this very nimble narrator that's kind of moving throughout and giving also more like objective information about the entire place. Very much like when we had the description of the Dante-esque moment, we have the description that's kind of this broad description of the river itself, which, is being raised to this kind of Dante-esque level. And then we're moving into the individuality of the actual priest who is arriving at that moment, kind of like busting into this moment of like Dante-esque drama. So I want to take a slightly closer look at this narrative voice. So on page 5, so we're just a couple of pages in, we have descriptions of both Laura and of someone named Morris. Laura shook back her dampish long hair. In theory, her looks depended on the services of many employees. My hairdresser, my last hairdresser, my doctor, my other doctor who I went to when I found the first one wasn't doing me any good. But with or without their attentions, Laura would always be beautiful. So we have this interesting toggling here. Obviously, when we're saying Laura shook back her dampish, longish hair. It's so funny. I'm just noticing it. Dampish, longish is so excellent. I mean, this is the originality and the uniqueness of this prose that makes it so amazing. So, but the idea of Laura shook back her hair, that's a third person narrator that's just describing from the outside what Laura is doing. But then by saying my hairdresser, my last hairdresser, my doctor, my other doctor, which again, it should be almost too heavy-handed, this kind of litany that we're hearing that speaks to all kinds of like indecision and all kinds of maybe like pickiness or high expectations or expectations that are not being met or moving around. It's speaking to all sorts of different possibilities that Laura is suffering. But when you put it in like my doctor and my hairdresser, we're moving from this third person narrator into kind of like it's into her own voice. And then just a little bit further down on the same page, we have a description of Morris. So I'm realizing Maurice is how like to my mind, to my American mind, Maurice, I would say Maurice. But one of the things that happened this time is I both was rereading my physical copy and I was also listening to the book on Audible. And they always refer to him as Morris, which is, of course, very British because lots of, I think we kind of Americans tend to sometimes be kind of like Francophiles, but given a little bit of friction between the British people and the French people, often they'll really like try to anglicize whatever kind of French word you have. So he's definitely known as Morris. It's also delightful because it's a British person. It's also so shocking because it's a British man who's reading. And then when he's reading the voice of Nena, of course, it's a Canadian accent, which to my ear sounds mostly American, which is such an interesting thing because it's easy to forget at times that she is Canadian. So it's interesting to have this to have her voice seem different than other people's, but also her voice, she is different than a lot of these people in many different ways, one of them being her accent. But here on page 5, we have this really beautiful description of Morris. And what I want to focus on here is the candor. So we have this narrative voice who is telling us important details and is not judging. So a lot of what is being told, even from the very beginning, when they're like, okay, when Dreadnought's like, guys, could you please basically like, you don't have to lie, but please don't tell them my boat is leaking. And then we have Richard, who's like this very upright naval guy, and he's like trying to be patient and he's trying not to judge. And everyone is there's just like an enormous amount of compassion through the whole thing. So on page 5, we have this. In the saloon, Morris, who had come rather late, was saying something intended to be in favor of Willis. He was incurably sympathetic. I love that. Incurably sympathetic is so good. His occupation, which was that of picking up men in a neighboring public house, with which he had a working arrangement, during the evening hours and bringing them back to the boat, was not particularly profitable. Morris was not born to make a profit, but then was not born to resent this or anything else. It's so lovely. This idea, you think when he says that his arrangement is bringing home these men from the public house, and the narrator starts to say was not particularly, and you kind of get the sense of like was not particularly well thought of or was not particularly moral, or like you feel like there's a judgment coming, and then it's so great because she subverts it and says was not particularly profitable. Then she goes one step further in this kind of like lack of judgment, and it's just very clear like he's not meant to make a profit, but it doesn't particularly bother him, and nothing else really bothers him either. It's just a beautiful, like very rich, and this is where the economical thing in those blurbs comes in. It's very economical in the sense that we're learning what he does, but we're also learning, she's telling us like he wasn't born to make a profit and that did not bother him, and the people around him are not judging him for the fact that he is a sex worker. It is so strong. So I want to continue a little bit this exploration of this unique narrative voice. And at the same time, I want to take a look at these off-kilter and really revealing descriptions that we have of minor characters. So we mentioned Father Watson earlier. He was the one who like tripped over the creosote can right when we were having like our Dante-esque moment. And we have another description of him. It's actually a little bit before we see him trying to get onto the boat and tripping. On page 17, we have him meeting Nena. As soon as they reached the embankment, Father Watson began to speak in measured tones. It's the children, as you must be aware, that I've come about. A message from the nuns, a message from the Sisters of Misericord. He sometimes wondered if he would be more successful in the embarrassing errands he was called upon to undertake, if he had an Irish accent or some quaint turn of speech. So I love this so much. So what we have here, though, and the important thing is we have the narrative voice that's very kind of authoritative and removed. As soon as they reached the embankment, Father Watson began to speak. So that's a very like pulled back third person narrator. Then we have his actual quotation, it's the children. And then we have a sentence that comes directly from his consciousness. He sometimes wondered if he would be more successful in the embarrassing errands he was called upon to undertake if he had an Irish accent or some quaint turn of speech. It is so good and so revealing. First of all, he's embarrassed about these errands he's having to run, but also this idea of the Irish accent is so funny. Like, it's also a really interesting take here because they're Catholic in a country that is not a Catholic country. And of course, you have tensions between the Irish and the English, but he's wanting the Irish accent in order to make the embarrassment feel like slightly less acute for him. So this nimble narrator is giving us both objective information and also is inside the consciousness of what these people are thinking, which is often hilarious and revealing about everyone and about society in general, not simply about the one character. So the next description is very brief. It's very late in the novel. This is on, or it's not very late, but it's later in the novel. It's on page 125, and it's very brief, but it says just absolute volumes. What we have here is, Richard was the kind of man who has 2 clean handkerchiefs on him at 3:30 in the morning. It's so strong. This is, again, that kind of economy that they're talking about, but it's also the richness. It's why it is definitely economical. Like, she's telling us so much about him just with that one detail, but it's also so rich in the sense that it's 3:30 in the morning. They're up when they shouldn't be up. All sorts of mayhem is happening at this point in the novel. But we are reminded in this very economical way about exactly who he is and being told even more about the high stakes of the moment and how he's handling them. So on 136, we have another paragraph. This is a very minor character. It's a young teenager named Heinrich. And this also speaks to the range that we have. This is someone who's different from the other characters that we know better. But even when we have a minor character, we have this incredible breadth and roundness. Just every character, whether they are major or minor characters, are given so much complexity. So we have this. Heinrich was exceptionally elegant, an upbringing designed to carry him through changes of regime and frontier, possible loss of every world possession, and, in the event of a crisis, protracted stays with distant relatives ensconced wherever the aristocracy was tolerated, from the Polish border to Hyde Park Gate. In short, a good European background had made him totally self-contained and able, with sunny smile and the formal handshake of the gymnast, to set almost anybody at their ease, even the flustered Nana. So again, we have this incredible off-kilter thing here about the handshake of a gymnast. It's so telling. It's so interesting. And we have this narrator who is moving all the way from regime changes and the border of Poland all the way to Hyde Park Gate, like this huge canvas that she is painting on. And then also specificity like the handshake of a gymnast that is so it's unique and interesting and so revealing. And some of the characters who are most sort of noteworthy and best drawn in Fitzgerald, in my opinion, are the children. So a lot of the kids in this, it's kind of like Salinger. A lot of them are very sophisticated and they're often very wise. And she said in the introduction, Hermione Lee spoke about a moment when one of the friends of Penelope Fitzgerald was saying that the kids in her writing, the children, seemed a little precious. And she just hit right back with this idea that they don't seem precious at all to her. And in fact, they seem exactly like her own children who never, ever miss a thing. I'm obviously paraphrasing here. So the children in this novel in particular, but in all of Fitzgerald, can be really important. It's fascinating to look at. So on page 21, we have this. Nana would have felt better pleased with herself if she had resembled her elder daughter. But Martha, small and thin, with dark eyes which already showed an acceptance of the world's shortcomings, was not like her mother and even less like her father. The crucial moment when children realize that their parents are younger than they are had long since been passed by Martha. And it's so subtle what's happening here, but when she's saying the crucial moment when children realize their parents are younger than they are, and parents, are not in fact younger than their children, but in this case, it is a fact that is so incontrovertible that Martha has realized it, and it is simply recognized as a fact. And there's a description of her younger daughter that tells us it's an example of these kind of broader sweeping things that she says, again, with enormous economy, but that is very revealing. So on page 26, she is describing Nana's younger daughter, Tilda. Tilda cared nothing for the future and had, as a result, a great capacity for happiness. At the moment, she was perfectly happy. So this is telling us, like, it's not all about kind of quirky details. In fact, she can just give you like these very broad strokes. But also here, this idea that she cared nothing for the future is such an important kind of insight. So part of the richness of the novel is these big pronouncements. Like, this kid's happy because she doesn't care about the future. We should all care less about the future. There are lots of ways that I could talk about humor, and we've already seen some of the funny, like very subtle and really elegant and smart humor in the book. But on 33, we get a great sense of the humor with respect to the kids. On 33, the narrator is talking about the little girls and their singing voices. And also, when I read this, you're going to have to forgive me my German. I have no German. They could still manage abends, wenn wir schlafen gehen, taught them by the nuns as a party piece, and then, indeed, they sounded like angels, though angels without much grasp of the words after the second line. More successful, perhaps, was Jailhouse Rock. So this is an important moment. These are all of these people are caught not only offshore in the sense of like not on land and not on shore, but it's a very interesting time in history where people are betwixt and between. So it's at the very beginning of the 60s. So you have this idea of everybody being kind of on the verge of swinging London, and yet these people are pretty far away from it. The little girls have a Cliff Richards, I'm pretty sure that's right. They have that record. They have Jailhouse Rock. They're into Elvis. So you have this kind of late 50s, early 60s sense of where they are in time. But this is such an important, like, this is the way that she is alerting us to that. We have this kind of religious thing on the one hand, and then we have the idea of Jailhouse Rock, the idea of rock and roll, and the girls as being able to straddle both. But then, of course, there's that hilarious line about angels who don't have much grasp of the words beyond the second line. So it's humor, but it is serving the important thing of talking about them as being kind of suspended between two things. We could open this book to any page and end up with something that we could talk about for hours, because everything has so much significance and everything is so well done. So now I want to dive into the idea of figurative language. Figurative language is simply any language that is doing more than just saying what it is saying. That is not a great description. So things like metaphor or simile or personification, when language is giving you more than just what is stated there. So if you are ever reading through something and you're coming across a house or a garden, you should take a second to find out whether or not that house or that garden has kind of metaphorical meaning. So lots of times the house can be read as like emblematic or indicative of what is happening for the people who are living in it. So if you have a house that's all run down, that's going to tell you something about the family. Same thing with the garden. If the garden is very orderly and, well kept, that's one thing versus one that is choked with weeds or whatever the situation may be. In this case, it is fascinating to look at the idea that each of them is living in a boat. So they're living in something that is stationary, but that's meant to be moving around. It is something, this is like, it's so kind of on the nose that it should feel too on the nose. But these are boats that are being, lifted by tides and then brought back down. These are boats that are always at risk of sinking. They're leaking. All of these things that are happening to these boats are metaphorical in the sense that is showing us very much about like how they, like their names. The names are so fascinating and should be kind of too on the nose. Like Morris's boat had this long German name, and when he realized that everybody was going to have to call him by this super long German name, keep in mind that this is the 50s, so it's very soon after the Second World War, he changes the name of the boat to Morris so that when they're in, harbor and they're all talking to each other and Dreadnought is talking to Lord Jim, who's talking to Grace, then they'll just be able to say Morris. It is so genius. And in addition to the names that each of the boat has and how revealing those names are, you also simply have the idea that the different types of boats are indicative of the different types of people, and the issues they have might be indicative of the issues of the people. So the idea of house as metaphor is very interesting here because boats are their houses. We also have quite a bit of personification, and the first way that we're going to look at that is a time when we are describing the boats, which is very handy. So on page 6, we have this. At that moment, Lord Jim was disturbed from stem to stern by an unmistakable lurch. Nothing fell, because on Lord Jim everything was properly secured, but she heaved, seemed to shake herself gently, and rose. The tide had lifted her. So the part, of course, that is personification here is this idea of that she seemed to shake herself gently. I've been thinking about this new thing recently, like personification, like an animal could shake itself gently. And in fact, in some ways, it seems more like something a dog would do here. So instead of personification, which is what we all learned back in sophomore English, I like to think of this as animacy. So giving animacy to something that is inanimate. The boat itself is not, it doesn't have, like, it can't move. I mean, it can move, but it can't do it itself. It doesn't have agency. But this idea of that she heaved, seemed to shake herself gently, and rose, this idea that she has agency. And of course, I love the fact that Lord Jim is also female. All of this is this kind of incredible complexity. And then right across the page, that idea kind of intensifies on page 7. The crazy old vessels riding high in the water without cargo awaited their owners' returns. So again, this makes it sound even like a little bit more like a dog, actually, in my mind. But the idea of the vessels waiting for their owner's returns gives them agency and animacy. So when we have personification, and there's lots of it throughout the book, we're not going to look at other instances of it, but there's a lot of it throughout. It's great to notice that this is personification, but it's even better to ask yourself, like, so what? Like, why is it adding to the way that we are reading this novel? And in this book, there's this idea of compassion and of empathy that is everywhere. So if you are allowing a boat to have agency, like a boat is something that is awaiting its owner's return, we have this idea of feeling sympathy and compassion for these boats who are, presumably kind of lonely while they're awaiting the return of their owners. So you do have this beautiful sense of everything. If everything is a little bit alive, then we need to have compassion and sympathy for all of these different things. It's interesting in Hangs a Man, that Shirley Jackson one, a lot of the personification ends up feeling kind of eerie and scary. A lot of what is happening, there's a thing where trees are overgrowing and everything's kind of menacing. In here, it's much more about everything being kind of open and vulnerable. The personification is just incredibly rich. So one of the most kind of basic forms of figurative language is the idea of metaphor or simile. So this is simply it's a comparison. Simile uses like or as, and metaphor does not. And I am someone who is very, very picky about her metaphors. My thing about like figurative language as a whole is like, if you are not really good at it, do not bother. Because if a metaphor or a simile if it's too far afield, if the things are too weird, and then suddenly as the reader, you're like, wait, why are we comparing this to that? You're pulled out of the story and it's really not good. It detracts from your enjoyment of the story. In Offshore, Penelope Fitzgerald again and again has the most beautiful similes and metaphors. Not only that, but she does this thing where she'll link them. So she'll bring up kind of a metaphor, and then a few pages later or 10 pages later, we'll have it kind of re-emerge in a way that ties together a lot of the disparate elements of the novel. So on page 79, we have a moment when one of the people, Richard, who is the one who is Lord Jim, we have him meeting together with a friend named Pinky. They're having some drinks. And then we have this description. Pinky sucked in his drink in a curious manner, as though his glass was a blowhole in Arctic ice and to drink was his only hope of survival. Which is really showing us like the desperation here. And then a little further down, we have that Pinky replied, wallowing through his barrier of ice. So we have this kind of extension of of the simile there. And then 10 pages later, we have the reemergence of this kind of ice. And obviously the idea of Arctic ice, of getting breath, all of that has to do with the ocean and with water and drowning. So all of these things are very appropriate given the fact that this is a story about boats. So on page 74, we have this description of when Nena is thinking about money. Nena believed, however, that she would have some in the spring, when 3 things would happen, each, like melting ice floes, slowly moving the next one on. So not only do we have this apt simile, but we have it come up again in a way that is kind of tying things together, even if it's on like a very sort of deep kind of subconscious level. And as you might imagine, there's lots of amazing figurative language that comes up with the girls. I want to look at just 2 quick instances. So on page 79, and this is when the girls are, they go mudlarking, which is not something I knew, but when the tide goes out on the Thames, there's this mud, and they would go and like look for treasures. And actually, they're looking for treasures that are important because these are treasures they can sell, and everyone is desperate for money. So on 79, we have this. With a tile in each hand, balancing like a circus performer, Tilda returned. Under the garish lights of the big top, every man, woman, and child rose to applaud. Who, they asked each other, was this newcomer who had succeeded where so many others had failed? So I love this so much. I mean, obviously here, the only like simile that we have in the beginning is that she's balancing like a circus performer. But this idea of the inner landscape of this young girl, Tilda, I think is about 6, Martha's about 8, maybe older. Maybe they're a little older than that. But she's someone who has this very vivid kind of interior world. And it is so beautiful. We have this quick metaphor. She's balancing like a circus performer. But it's really significant. This is very fertile kind of imagination this child has. We have like a conversation that is going on among, the people who are attending the circus. Who, they asked each other, was this newcomer who had succeeded where so many others had failed. So we have this idea of failure. We have this idea as a young child, she has lots of confidence. If you recall, she expects nothing of the future, which makes her happy. But you do have a sense of failure as surrounding her. It is so strong. So here she is a circus performer, and then 2 pages later, we have Tilda began to jump up and down like a cork on the tide. So we have this idea here of that being very apt. Again, earlier we had the ice flows, and now we have the cork on the tide. It's so joyous, and it's also kind of dangerous, this idea of being, just like bobbing along on the water. But this is the kind of simile that really adds so much richness. The last type of figurative language I want to look at is this idea of symbolism. So throughout the entire novel, literally you could choose any item and we could talk about its symbolic value. Everything has so much nuance and has so much meaning. But what I want to look at is it's toward the end of the book, and it is so, it's such an incredible mixture of poignant and sad and funny. So what is happening here is Nana is in really not great condition, and she is walking along a street. And again, much of the novel has to do with her as a mother, but also as kind of a failed mother in some ways. She's not getting her kids to school. They're having to essentially parent her. They're often like totally unsupervised. And also of her as a failed partner, a failed wife. So we have her in this vulnerable moment walking along. And really, in many ways, this is a very low point, if not the low point for her in the novel. So on 120, and again, here what we're looking at is the figurative language. Handfuls of sleet were beginning to wander through the air, which is so amazing to me. I mean, handfuls of sleet. So we have this idea of handfuls of it, which is odd and kind of strange, but also like so telling. But then handfuls wandering, we have almost like a mixed metaphor there that is still like very effective. So handfuls of fleet were beginning to wander through the air. Radio shop, bicycle shop, family planning shop, funeral parlor, bicycles, radio spare parts, television hire, herbalist, family planning, a florist. This is such an incredible lineup. So here we have a radio shop, so we have communication. Then we have the family planning shop right next to a funeral parlor, which is such a fascinating juxtaposition between kind of life and death here. Of course, family planning, she's talking here about both the husband and the children in a way that's so kind of dark and defeated in many ways. So if we just take a quick step back and think about the function of figurative language in this book, not only does it speak to the richness and the originality of what Penelope Fitzgerald's doing, but it also speaks to a certain amount of depth. And also this idea of like one thing as describing something else speaks to the idea that nothing can be very much pinned down. We don't have, at times she's making very like clear assertions, but a lot of this book is sort of like everything is standing in for something else because it is a book that is deeply preoccupied with the idea of things being transitory, things being unstable, things rising and falling, things being unpredictable, things leaking. We have children who are being parents. We have everybody's kind of like in flux in a way that's really interesting. And I think that the idea of using quite a bit of figurative language is really fitting. So if we think about figurative language as being kind of multiplying things and making them kind of unsteady and adding some sort of ambivalence and some complexity, that's a very good segue into the end of the book. If you are not wanting to hear about the end of the book, this might be the perfect time to leave, to jump ship, as it were. I can wish you right now happy reading, and I can thank you for tuning in. If you want to hear about my take on the end of the book, you can listen on. So I loved the ending of this book. If you were someone who was reading through and thinking you were going to have a happy ending, I think maybe you missed a couple of important cues as we were moving through. But the ending is very much like the rest of the book, is very subtle and ambivalent in lots of ways. So I believe at the end we are meant to think, even though it is not totally conclusive, we are meant to think that Nana is going to return to Canada with her sister and her 2 daughters. But what's absolutely heartbreaking is at the final end of the book, we have Edward coming to Grace, not to Grace itself. He's wanting to come to the boat to Grace, but in fact, he comes to Morris's boat. We have this crazy storm that is happening. And we know that Edward is coming to reconcile. He's coming to bring Nana her purse. In fact, there's a lovely passage that has lots of figurative language about how her entire identity is held in that purse. But we have this idea of him returning with her identity, and he has 2 glasses and whiskey. So you have this sense that he wants to reconcile, but things seem a bit late. And the very ending of the book, when we have Morris, who is someone who is sort of doomed from the start, we have Morris together with Edward, who also is someone who cannot seem to get his act together and has really been having a hard time. Both of these men who are sort of fated to not do well, they're getting very drunk together. And then essentially they're on this boat that is starting to move out to sea. So you can read this as optimistically as you might like. And yet there are lots of indications that things are not going to end well for them. But in some ways, you can almost read that. I mean, it's not like Nana and Edward had some sort of happy life together. And it's not like theirs was a marriage that we were really like rooting for. It didn't seem, it seems in many ways like what we want for Nana is a fresh start with perhaps a bit more stability. But I love the fact that Penelope Fitzgerald is giving us this kind of ambivalent, open-ended finish, because that to me feels very much of a piece of this book that is a real exploration of humanity, but that is not judging, and it's not looking for hard and fast ways to look at the world. I find the open-ended nature of the ending really just so satisfying. I'm sure that there are people who really want to know what happened, but I think maybe you can take solace in the fact that Penelope Fitzgerald is the kind of writer who isn't going to hand us things that are tidy and things that are imparting some sort of moral stance. Instead, she's really leaving us to enjoy these characters for this brief time when we're all together with them, and to understand, that life is fleeting, and that genuine human connection, wherever you can find it, is difficult, and that what we all really need is a lot of compassion for one another. It feels strange to sort of like come up with a conclusion like that, but I do really have a sense that throughout the entire work of Penelope Fitzgerald, because we are looking at these characters who are really complicated and lots of times quote unquote failures, that she's not going to aspire, to have these be some sort of like stories of perseverance and victory, but instead ones where we can really take a lot of solace. So I hope today's deep dive, I guess I shouldn't be talking about a deep dive when we're talking about a book that is set on a river, but I hope today's deep dive allowed you to appreciate a little more this just incredible short novel by a writer I absolutely love. So thank you so much for listening. Happy reading.